The woods were damp and dark just after sunset. I was holding a dying wolf cub in my lap. Its breathing was a wet, ragged sound. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I knew I couldn't save it. That knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. All I could do was give it a quiet end. And here's where it gets crazy. The cub lifted its head one last time. It nuzzled my palm with its cold nose. Its last breath warmed my skin, then a different warmth shot up my arm. It was a shock that went straight to my bones. For a second my hands glowed with a faint gold light. The warmth spread through my whole body, then the light just vanished. The cub was gone. The sudden silence was broken by a twig snapping. I looked up. 2 men were at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Kalen Thorne, the alpha from the northern pack, stood frozen. He stared at me and inhaled sharply. On the opposite side, Vexus Crow watched from the shadows. His usual smug smile was gone. His face showed only stark surprise. Both of them looked from the dead cub to my face. The air felt thick with a tension I didn't understand. Kalen took a slow step toward me. Vexus mirrored him from the other side. They moved with a predator's grace. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my tingling hand to my chest. I didn't know what I'd just done. I only knew I was now the focus of 2 powerful alphas, and their attention felt more dangerous than anything else in those woods. The phantom weight of that cub still pressed against my chest. My new world was a concrete cell. It smelled like mildew and old blood. Kalen Thorne stood over me. He crossed his arms, and his knuckles were white where he gripped his own bicep. The silence was so thick I could barely breathe. "You are my mate," Kalen said. His voice was low and insistent. "The bond is fate. It's not a choice for either of us." I scrambled back on the thin cot until my shoulders hit the cold wall. He wasn't human. I had to keep reminding myself of that. His words were a prison sentence. My fear seemed to fill the small space. It smelled sharp and sour. Kalen flinched back a half step. Something like hurt flashed across his face before it hardened again. He reached out one hand toward me, not to grab, but to steady. I flinched harder and banged my head against the concrete. He dropped his hand. His jaw was so tight I could see the muscle flexing. "Why won't you just understand?" he asked, more to himself than to me. He turned away and ran a hand through his hair. Then he walked to the heavy metal door and yanked it open. "Felix," he barked. My friend stood just outside, his face pale. "Guard the door. Do not let anyone in." Kalen looked back at me once, his expression unreadable. Then he just walked out. I sat curled against the wall for hours. The single bulb above buzzed and blinked. The door opened without a sound. Kalen stood there with a blanket in one hand. He looked bigger in the small space. He didn't come all the way inside. He just placed the blanket and a bottle of water on the floor near the door. "You should try to rest," he said. His voice was rough like gravel. "I can't," I said. My own voice was a dry scrape. He leaned back against the wall opposite me and slid down to sit. He looked at his own hands for a long time. The flickering light caught a deep scar across his chest. "The pull," he said. He stopped and let out a slow breath. "It hurts me too when you fight it." He said this to the floor, not to me. His shoulders weren't straight and proud anymore. They curved forward like something heavy was sitting on them. The silence after he left was worse than the shouting. That pull in my chest, that stupid bond, it felt like a hook was set right under my ribs. It was tugging me toward the door he'd just walked out of. I locked my knees and dug my nails into my own palms. The pain was clean. It was mine. I chose it. He looked at my hands. He saw what I was doing. And for a second, he didn't look angry. He looked tired. He understood. He stood up to leave, but then he stopped. He took one small step back toward me, just one. His hand was halfway up like he was going to reach out. Then he shook his head like he was clearing it and he walked out. The door clicked shut, soft and final. I was alone again. The blanket was still on the floor. The light was still buzzing. My hands stung where I'd pressed my nails in, and my chest ached with the ghost of that pull. Why did he step back? I'd been wrong to ignore that. It meant something. Real quick, if you're here for the human girl holding her own against 2 alphas, hit subscribe. The part where I finally fight back is coming up. The next morning, I was sitting on the bathroom windowsill, watching the frost on the glass. My chest still ached. A soft knock came at the door. It was an older woman named Niam. She brought food. Her eyes were kind, but she wouldn't look directly at me. "Where's Felix?" I asked. My voice sounded small. She set the tray down. "He is not in the compound," she said, her voice quiet. "He has been unaccounted for since your arrival." A cold feeling washed over me. He was out there alone because of me. "I need to leave," I said, standing up. Please help me." She moved to block the door. "The Alpha commanded that you be kept safe inside these rooms." Safe? It sounded like another word for cage. My eyes darted to the bathroom counter. There was a broken ceramic soap dish from the night before. I edged toward it while she spoke in soft, pleading tones about my own protection. My fingers closed around the largest shard. It had a wicked, jagged edge. I turned and faced her, holding it low, the point aimed at the soft skin of my own forearm. "I will not hurt you," I said. My hand was perfectly steady, even though my heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. "But I need you to move." Niam's eyes went wide. Not with fear, but with a deep, sad pity. She understood exactly what I was willing to do. She looked from my face to the ceramic pressed to my skin. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole forest, she stepped aside. "The woods will not be kind to a human in Senchok," she whispered as I passed her. I didn't look back. I ran into the empty hall, the shard gripped tight in my hand, the bond in my chest a dull throb I refused to listen to. I ran until my lungs burned, stumbling into a quiet grove of pine trees. The air was sharp and clean. I pressed my back against a thick oak tree, trying to listen, trying to think. I needed a plan. Find Felix, get out before Kalen found me first. The thought of him sent a confusing warmth through my chest. I hated it. A twig snapped. I froze. Kalen stepped into the clearing. He moved silently, but his eyes went right to my hiding place. He knew I was there. I saw his shoulders relax just a little, a tiny sign of relief. He'd taken that step back in the cell, not to cage me, because he couldn't stay away. The bond worked both ways, and that was the most terrifying part. Ilara. He said my name. It wasn't a command this time. It was just my name. I stepped out from behind the tree, the ceramic shard still in my hand. He looked at it, then at my face. He just looked tired. "You cannot outrun this," he said, "or me." Then a voice came from the shadows between the pines. "But you can outrun him." Vexus Crow melted into view. He was holding a long knife loosely at his side. He pointed the blade at Kalen. "Come with me. I do not believe in fate." Kalen shifted instantly, putting his body between me and Vexus. I looked from one alpha to the other. This was a fight over a claim I never asked for. Kalen's attention was locked on Vexus, a low growl building in his chest, but I saw his hand open slightly at his side. An invitation, not a demand. This was their answer to everything. Violence. Teeth and blood. My hand tightened around the ceramic shard. I could use it. I could try to hurt one of them, create a distraction, run. But that would just pull me deeper into their world. I thought of Felix, lost out here because of me. I thought of my old, normal life. The life I was desperately trying to get back to. I opened my fingers. The shard fell to the mossy ground without a sound. I didn't have a plan anymore. I just knew I couldn't fight them with their own weapons. The new room they put me in was cold. It smelled like ozone and metal. I found a small service alcove off the main hallway and just slid down the wall. My legs finally gave out. I put my forehead on my knees. The bond was a steady, warm pull behind my ribs, a leash I couldn't see or break. I had to find Felix. But a terrible new question was forming in my mind, one I was too scared to answer out loud. If I called for him now, would he even understand me? The door to the alcove opened without a sound. Kalen stood there. He didn't storm in, he just looked at me. His shoulders weren't set for a fight. He let out a long breath and stepped inside. He closed the door and leaned back against it, staying on the other side of the small space. "Running hurts us both," he said. His voice was low. It wasn't a growl. I wasn't running, I was hiding. The truth felt stupid when I said it out loud. He nodded like that made sense. Then he did something I didn't expect. He slid down the door to sit on the floor, mirroring me. He rested his arms on his knees and looked at the floor between us. He was quiet for a long time. The silence wasn't angry. "Your fear is a knife," he said finally. He didn't look up. "It twists in a wound I did not choose." The words were simple. They hit me in the stomach. He hadn't chosen me. Something else had put us here. There was a difference. I saw his hand where it rested on his knee. His fingers were spread wide, pressing into the fabric of his pants. They were completely still. It was a controlled, deliberate stillness. I saw he was holding himself there. He was fighting the instinct to come closer. The bond ached between us, a warm, stubborn thing. I wanted to ask about Felix. I didn't. He looked up then. His eyes found mine. The gold in them was dull with a tiredness I understood. He opened his mouth like he might say more. Then he closed it. He shook his head once, a small movement. He pushed himself up from the floor and stood looking down at me. The space between us felt thick and full. He turned and opened the door. He left without another word. The warmth in my chest pulled after him. I stayed on the cold floor, listening to the hum of the lights. Why he'd opened his mouth only to close it again, that wasn't going away. Later, I was in the guest suite, staring at the rug. Kalen stood by the cold fireplace. He didn't look at me. A knock sounded on the door, sharp and formal. Kalen's head lifted. He moved to open it himself, his body blocking my view of the hall. Vexus Crow stood there. He offered a shallow bow that didn't reach his eyes. "I came to check on the well-being of our alphas, mate," Vexus said. His voice was smooth oil. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I felt my back press into the chair. Kalen didn't move from his place between us. Vexus looked around the room, his eyes touching everything but me. Such a tragic day for the pack. To lose a cub is a deep wound. "Your condolences are noted," Kalen said. His words were clipped stones. "Of course." Vexus finally looked at me. "The little one was your nephew, was he not, Alpha? A terrible weight for a leader to carry." I saw Kalen's hand, resting on the mantel, curl inward. His fingernails dug into his own palm. Vexus continued, his tone light. "The patrol schedules were in some dispute that night. The western border was so thinly watched. A simple miscommunication, I'm sure." He turned to leave, then paused. "I wish you strength, Kalen, to bear such a heavy, personal failure." The door shut behind him. The silence in the room was thick and hot. Kalen didn't turn around. His shoulders were a straight, hard line under his shirt. I stood up. My heart was beating too fast. I walked toward him, not knowing why. I saw the side of his face. His eyes were shut tight. A single muscle in his jaw jumped over and over. He was holding his breath. He didn't deny anything Vexus had said. The raw guilt was there, plain on his face for a second before he locked it away. I didn't touch him. I just stood there, close enough to feel the heat from his skin. My hand had stopped shaking when I dropped the shard because I'd chosen a different kind of fight. This quiet sharing of a burden felt like that same choice. Why I hadn't touched him when the guilt was so plain? That question stuck with me. Later that night, I found myself at the edge of the moonlit grove. I'd meant to run straight through to find the border and Felix. The sound of soft weeping stopped me. It came from a small mound of dirt near a ring of smooth, dark stones. White flowers were scattered across it. I knew what it was. My feet moved on their own. I knelt in the damp soil before the cub's grave. The grief was a solid, sudden weight in my chest. It pushed the air from my lungs. I reached out and touched a cold petal. "I'm so sorry, little one," I whispered. A branch cracked behind me. I froze. The weeping had stopped. I turned my head slowly. Kalen stood between two tall pines. Moonlight cut across the broad line of his shoulders. He didn't look angry. He looked hollow. The usual fierce command in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. He just watched me. I'd trespassed on something sacred and private. My own sadness twisted into a sharp, defensive fear. I stood up too fast, my boots slipping in the mud. "I didn't mean to," I said. My voice was too loud in the quiet grove. He stepped into the full moonlight. He wasn't wearing his usual heavy jacket, just a dark shirt. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. I saw a long, pale scar running down his forearm. It was old and ragged. That detail felt too human, too vulnerable for him. He didn't move toward me. He just stood there, looking from me to the grave and back again. The bond between us gave a dull, sympathetic throb in my ribs. It felt like shared hurt, not a chain. I remembered his confession in the woods, his guilt. The way he looked at me just then wasn't about the threat. I didn't know what to do with that. The weeping had stopped. I turned and there he was. Kalen, standing between the pines, moonlight cutting across his shoulders. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed out. "Why are you here?" His voice was rough, gravelly, like he hadn't spoken all night. He wasn't asking about the grove. He was asking why I'd come to the grave, why I'd spoken to it. I saw his throat work. He opened his mouth, then pressed his lips into a tight line. He stopped himself. I understood right then. He'd been about to give an order, to demand an answer. But in this place, with this grief between us, command would have been a violence, so he just waited. His question hung in the cold air, a sacrifice of his own instinct, everything else I could deal with. Why he'd stopped himself, that was different. "I heard crying," I said. My voice was too small. "I didn't know it was you. I didn't know this was here." I gestured to the small mound. The flowers I'd touched lay wilted on the moss. He watched my hand move. His own hands hung loose, but his fingers were curled in. Not quite fists. The grief on him was plain. It was heavy. This wasn't the bond's pull. This was a choice he lived with, a weight I could see. He was my sister's son, Kaelin said. His voice was low. He didn't look at me, he looked at the grave. She's gone too, a year ago. He paused, the leaves rustled. I promised her I would keep him safe. There it was, the crack. His admission was the vulnerability. The long pause before it was the tell. I noticed it. I didn't know what to do with that raw honesty laid bare. I wanted to say it wasn't his fault, but the words felt empty. So I said nothing. The wrong thing would have been a lie. Vexus's words about the patrol schedule came back to me. I understood the guilt now. I also understood it was a weapon for his rival. Kaelin was a man standing over a grave, not just an alpha asserting a claim. The frightening pull I felt twisted into something else. An ache, a shared space of hurt. My decision wasn't strategy. It was that ache. I took a step forward on the moss, an active step. Into his grief, not away from it. I didn't reach for him. I just stood beside him, facing the small mound of earth. We were two people under a willow tree, silent before a loss. The bond was there, a thread between us, but for that moment it wasn't a chain. It was just a reason I'd come to this quiet, sad place. He didn't tell me to leave, he just stood there. A tall, silent shape in the moonlight. The space between us felt heavy, still, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I saw his hands. They weren't clenched. They hung at his sides, fingers loose and open. One hand twitched. Just once. Like it was reaching for something that wasn't there. That small movement was more shocking than any snarl. This wasn't a leader guarding territory. This was a man who'd forgotten for a second that anyone was watching. The rigid control he always wore was gone. In its place was a hollowed-out stillness that made my own chest tight. He could not catch them, Kaelin said. His voice was flat, worn thin. The fireflies, in summer. He would run through the tall grass behind the lodge. On his human legs. He stopped. I heard a sharp intake of breath. He hadn't meant to say that. It was a memory that escaped without permission. He would laugh when they slipped through his fingers. It was a loud, messy sound, like a bark that hadn't figured itself out yet. He finally turned his head toward me. His eyes weren't accusing, they were just exhausted. He took one step closer. The gap between us shrank by half. I could feel the faint warmth coming from him, a contrast to the freezing night. I didn't step back. My feet were rooted in the snow. He looked at me, I looked at him. The bond in my chest was a quiet, persistent pull, not a command. It was an ache to close that last distance. To share the weight of the story, he didn't move. I didn't move. We stood there on the edge of something. The unsaid words hung in the air like our fogged breaths. His name was Leo, he said, very quietly. Then he turned. He walked away, his footsteps crunching softly into the snow. He left me alone by the grave. The campfire was a rude shock of light and noise after the grove. Vexus Crow stood by the fire pit. He raised his voice over the murmur of the pack. Our alpha returns from private mourning, he said. His tone was smooth. It carried. He brings the human with him, the one who fled our protection, to trespass at the sacred grove. He looked right at me. A low grumble spread through the crowd. Kaelin stopped walking. He didn't look at me. His whole focus was on Vexus and on the pack watching them. The grove is under my protection, Kaelin said. His voice was flat now. All the gravelly grief from before was gone. Where I permit someone to go is not your concern. It is every pack member's concern, Vexus shot back. He took a step forward. When our leader's judgment falters. He looked right at the crowd. First, a cub dies under a disputed watch. Now, a stranger wanders our most private places. You bring this weakness among us and call it strength. The grumbling in the crowd got louder. I saw doubt on a lot of faces, and I finally understood why I hadn't reached for him back in the woods. I had wanted that quiet truth to stay hours alone. Now Vexus was using it as a weapon. Kaelin's head turned just slightly toward me. For a second, I saw the tight line of his mouth, the slight tremor in the muscle along his jaw. It wasn't anger. It was a terrible, heavy weight. Then his hand shot out and closed around my wrist. His grip wasn't gentle. He pulled me hard against his side. My shoulder bumped his arm. She was in the grove, he declared to the crowd, his voice ringing out, because the bond drew her to share in my grief. He paused, letting that sink in. She is my mate. Any who question her place question me. The silence that followed was complete, and stunned. I was a prop in his hands. My horror was a public spectacle. Vexus didn't look defeated. He just watched us. And his cold eyes were full of calculation. That question, why his eyes were full of calculation when he heard mate, sat there in my mind, like something unfinished. The ghost of Kalen's grip still burned like a brand around my wrist. I found myself at the tree line, away from the fire. The scent of damp pine needles rose up to meet the moon's cool light. He stood a few feet away, his back to me and to the pack. The moon broke through the clouds. His whole body went rigid. He grabbed his own forearm like he was trying to hold the bones inside. A sharp gasp hissed between his teeth. A low groan escaped his lips. It was a sound of pure strain. The bones in his shoulders made a sickening crackle, like wet wood snapping. I stumbled back. My feet scuffed loud in the dead leaves. His head bowed forward. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His world had rules I didn't understand. Rules I couldn't survive. For a second, his eyes met mine. They were wide and full of a terrible apology. "Run," he growled at me. His voice was already changing, becoming rough and deep. "To the lodge, now." He flung a trembling hand toward the path. His alpha command shook the air around me. It pushed at my skin. I did not run. I stood frozen. His human form seemed to blur at the edges before my eyes. His shirt strained across his back. Another crack echoed in the clearing. He shoved me hard behind him toward the lodge path. The shove wasn't violent. It was a desperate, final act of will. I finally moved. I turned and fled down the path. The cold air burned my lungs. I ran until my side ached. I stopped at the next bend and turned back. Kalen was on his knees in the clearing, his form twisted and reshaped under the moon's full glare. It was a violent, awful thing to watch. But as the wolf rose on 4 legs, shaking out its dark fur, it looked right at me. In its golden eyes, I saw the same profound grief from the grave. Then the beast shook its head. The human grief was gone, swallowed by the animal. I pushed the thought aside. Why the wolf looked right at me after shaking its head? That would come back to me later. My lungs still burned from the raw, panicked sprint through the cold forest air. The only light in Kalen's locked main room came from the moon. It cast a sharp silver rectangle across the floor where I stood. A heavy, rhythmic scraping sound came from the other side of the door. It was the wolf Kalen, slumped against it from the outside. I pressed my back to the far wall and slid down. We were both trapped. Him by the moon, me by his lock. I could see his shadow under the door, the slow rise and fall of his side. His golden wolf eyes watched me through the crack at the bottom. They weren't wild now, just tired and deep. I noticed a dark, wet patch on one of his front paws where it was visible. He had cut himself, running through the woods to get me here. Without a word, I pushed myself up. I remembered seeing a small metal box on a shelf, a first aid kit. I found it and brought it back to the door. I moved slowly, my hands open. He flinched when I reached for his paw, but he did not pull away. My fingers brushed the thick fur around the cut. A warm ache spread up my arm, not painful, just present. I cleaned the cut with a cloth from the kit. His head lowered after a moment. It rested on the floorboards near my knee. It wasn't a demand, just a heavy exhaustion. I left my hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The warmth from the contact was a steady hum between us. We stayed like that for a long time, 2 creatures held by a silent thread. I didn't know what it meant for tomorrow. But for now, the violence was spent. I put the thought away and got on with things. Why my hand still hummed where I'd touched his shoulder, that wouldn't stay put. The phantom weight of Kalen's shame still pressed against my own ribs, a shared burden I couldn't put down. The damp chill of the western border seeped through my jacket. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of shattered pine where the cub had fallen. Morning came. The alpha, Kalen, was human again. He sat on a fallen log wrapped in a coarse blanket. His back was to me. His shoulders were hunched so far forward the muscles looked like folded wings. He did not turn. He did not speak for a long time. The only sound was the drip of dew from the broken pine branches above us. The morning air was cold enough to hurt my lungs. "You saw everything," he said. His voice was rough from the change. "The monster I become." I shook my head. My own throat felt tight. "I saw you fighting to protect me. You pushed me toward the lodge." He turned his head then. His eyes were red-rimmed and they held a flash of anger. "That was the man. The beast just is. It does not choose." A single drop tracked from his temple to his jawline. It wasn't sweat. His words just hung there between us. My belief was simple. He had acted. His belief was a cage. I hadn't run from him last night. I'd stayed until the very last second. I'd seen the struggle in his wolf's eyes. His hands, which had been clenched white on the blanket's edge, slowly loosened. The fight seemed to just drain out of him. He looked at his own open palms like they belonged to someone else. Kalen stood up abruptly. He pulled the blanket tight around his shoulders. "The pack cannot see me like this," he said. His tone was flat, final, but he didn't move. He looked at me and his eyes held mine for a second too long. The way he looked at me just then, it wasn't the bond. I didn't know what that was. He was waiting for something. Was my way of seeing him the right one? He took a step toward the tree line, then paused. He glanced back, not at my face, but at the torn knee of my pants from my run through the woods. A sacrifice he'd forced me to make, and one I'd chosen anyway. Then he was gone into the trees. That question, why he'd looked at my torn knee, wouldn't leave me alone. The next morning, I stood on the gravel drive. The light was stark and flat, bleaching all the color from everything. The door to Kalen's lodge was unlocked. The silence inside felt heavier than any lock. I smelled pine soap and old wood. I found him in the main room, standing by a cold fireplace. He held a piece of paper. His fingers were careful with it. He didn't look at me. "Felix is gone," he said. His voice was empty. "The pack found his scent near the western border." My stomach dropped. I took a step forward. "You have to find him." "The border is not safe." Kalen finally turned. The morning light cut across his face. It showed the tight skin around his eyes. "Vexus and his followers patrol there. They are still volatile from the moon." "Then I'll go." The words were out before I thought. He made a low sound in his chest. It wasn't a growl. It was something tired. "You are my declared mate. Going there alone is a challenge. It is an excuse for violence." I looked at his hands. They weren't fists. They held that paper with a strange gentleness. I remembered the weight of his wolf's head near my leg in the dark. The warmth where my hand had rested on his shoulder hummed through my memory. It made my next words softer than I meant. "You could come with me." Kalen looked at the paper. He paused for a long moment. His shoulders sank a little. "My sister's son died on that border. My command failed him." He placed the paper on the mantel. His hand stayed there, braced against the wood. "If I lead you there and you are hurt, the wound would not close." I heard what he did not say. He was afraid. Not of Vexus, but of failing again. I didn't know what to do with that, so I said the wrong thing. "Staying here is a wound, too." He turned his head away from me first. The muscle in his jaw worked. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Get my coat from the hook. We go now, and you do exactly as I say." What happened next wasn't a search party. We got back to the lodge just as the storm hit for real. The generator lights flickered once, twice, and died. The room was plunged into a gray half-dark, smelling of ozone and wet pine from a shattered window. And here's where it gets crazy. A second pane of glass exploded inward. I flinched away from the flying shards. Kalen grabbed my arm and yanked me hard against the wall. His hand was like a brand. A sharp current shot up my shoulder. We both froze for a split second before we sprang apart. "The boards in the hall!" Kalen yelled over the howling wind. We moved at the same time, crashing into each other in the dark hallway. My shoulder brushed against the solid wall of his chest. I gasped and pulled back. We fumbled for the stack of plywood leaning against the wall. Our hands touched on the same rough edge. He took the heavier end without a word. We carried the awkward slab back toward the broken window. Rain lashed our faces. The wind tried to tear the board from our grip. Then a cracking sound came from above. A huge branch smashed through the window right next to us. Kalen shoved me to the floor. He covered my body with his own before the debris could hit. We lay there, breathing hard. His weight pinned me to the dusty floorboards. His face was inches from mine. In the near dark, his eyes glowed a faint wolf gold. My heart hammered so hard I felt it must be knocking against his ribs. The bond screamed at me to close that tiny space. Whatever I felt, it might just be the bond talking. I put both hands flat on his chest and pushed. He let me push him away. He rolled off me and stood up in one fluid motion. He offered me a hand. I took it. His palm was warm and rough. He turned toward the new hole in the wall where the branch stuck through. "We need to block this one first," he said. His voice was tight. I saw him glance at my leg. My jeans were torn at the knee from when he'd pushed me down. A fresh scrape stung there. He looked away quickly. He braced his back against the wind and started wrestling the branch free. I moved to help him, not because he told me to, but because the lodge was our only shelter now. The rest made sense. Why he'd looked away from my leg so quickly, that didn't. My ribs still ached from the bookshelf, and from his weight pinning me in the dark. An hour later, I was curled in a cracked leather armchair in the study. The storm was still growling outside, but the lodge had finally stopped groaning. Kalen sat on the floor with his back against the hearth. The space between us was just a worn-out rug. He stared into a single candle flame like it held a secret. My anger had drained away into just tired watching. I looked at his hands on his knees. They were broad, covered in old scars. One finger on his left hand was crooked. It bent at a wrong angle near the knuckle, like it had been broken and never set right. He saw me looking. He flexed that finger slowly. "My father," he said. His voice was low and flat. He believed pain was the best teacher for a future alpha. He said it to the flame, not to me. He hadn't meant to tell me that. I heard the old hurt in the words. A lesson carved right into his bones. A strange pull tugged in my chest. It wasn't entirely fear. I shifted in the chair. My foot brushed the edge of the rug near him. I let my hand fall to my side, my fingers touching the rough wool. Then I moved my hand just a little. My pinky finger touched the side of his hand where it rested on the floor. The contact was small, accidental. A sharp feeling went through my arm, a deep pull. He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were dark in the candlelight. He didn't move his hand away. He didn't speak. The air felt thick and still. I waited for him to pull back, to stand up, to break the moment. He just looked at me. I saw the question in his face and the same tired war I felt inside myself. Why my hand was still touching his in the dark. I'd been wrong to ignore it this long. The raw ache from his confession was still there, hollow in my chest. A moment later I stood on the rain-lashed porch, the cold spray the only real anchor I had. The door behind me flew open. Marlon, a young scout, stumbled out. He was gasping. Rain and blood streaked down his neck from a gash near his ear. "Alpha," he choked out, looking at Kaelin. "Vexus's patrol. They have a human at the old mill." Something locked in my chest. It was a sharp, physical stop. Marlon kept talking, his words tumbling out. "A young man. They're holding him for questioning." I knew. My hands went numb. It was Felix. Kaelin, who had been standing so close just seconds before, moved. He stepped past me toward Marlon. His face changed. All the softness from inside was gone. His expression went flat and hard. He hadn't chosen me. Something else had put us here. There was a difference. "How many are with him?" Kaelin's voice was low. It wasn't the voice of the man who'd shared his fears. It was the voice of an alpha assessing a threat. He looked back at me for a single second. His eyes were different. Focused, but the gold in them was dulled. Then he looked away toward the storm. "Rafe, Tomas," he called to the guards by the door. "Get your gear. We move in 5." He turned to me. "You will stay here." I was already moving. I snatched a heavy rain cloak from a hook. My fingers fumbled with the clasp. The metal was cold and slick. "You can't order me to stay," I said. My voice sounded thin against the rain. "That's Felix." Kaelin's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He just looked at the way my hands shook as I pulled the hood up. He gave a short, sharp nod. It wasn't permission. It was a grim acceptance of a new problem. He turned and started barking more orders. The warmth from our shared moment was gone, replaced by a cold, shared urgency. We were both running toward the same danger now, for different reasons. The chill of the cloak clung to me as I followed him inside. The war room's single oil lamp threw long, writhing shadows across a carved map table. 3 pack elders were already there. Their names were a blur, but their grim faces were clear. The oldest one, a man with a thick gray beard, spoke first. He pointed at a spot on the wooden map. He said this was a clear provocation from Vexus. He said rescuing a human trespasser would be seen as a sign of fatal weakness. The other elders nodded. Their voices were a low rumble of agreement. They said it would expose our pack's eastern flank. They said it confirmed that an outsider's influence was compromising their alpha. My stomach turned to ice. I saw Kaelin listening. His shoulders were squared. I stepped forward before they could say more. My palms slapped down on the cold, carved wood of the table. The sound was loud. "He's my friend," I said. My voice shook, but I didn't look away from Kaelin. "We can't just leave him there. You know what Vexus will do." The elders fell silent. They all looked to Kaelin. He hadn't moved from his place at the head of the table. He stood like a statue carved from the same dark stone as the walls. His eyes moved from my face, pale and desperate, to the stern faces of his council. A muscle in his cheek twitched. His duty was a chain I could feel tightening around us both. Marlon, the scout by the door, shifted his weight. Kaelin's head turned toward him. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. "You said they were holding him for questioning," Kaelin said. "What else did you hear?" Marlon looked at the floor. He wiped his hands on his pants. "There was chatter on the wind, Alpha," he said, before the storm drowned it out. "They were talking about a new serum." My blood went cold. Marlon kept going. He said Vexus's men were boasting. They said the serum was made from captive omegas. It could artificially amplify alpha power for a short time. They were using the human as bait, Marlon said, his voice low. They want to draw you out. They want to test it on you. The gray-bearded elder slammed his fist on the table. You see, he said, it is a trap, a direct challenge. To walk into it is suicide. Kalen finally looked at me. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were full of a raw, painful conflict. The bond between us felt like a silent scream in my chest. It wasn't a pull. It was a simple, awful understanding. He saw my terror for Felix. He saw the certain death of the trap. And I saw, in the way his hand pressed flat against the map, covering the marked location of the old mill, that he was already making his choice. I moved toward the door. His hand over the old mill, on the map, moved with me. The phantom ache of Kalen's grip on my wrist lingered as I finally stopped pacing. I stood in the empty solarium. The first weak rays of dawn glinted off the dewy glass. The council had left a heavy quiet behind. Kalen remained braced in the open doorway. He stared at the floorboards like they might crack under his weight. I dropped into a worn wicker chair. The dry leaves of a forgotten plant brushed my shoulder. We were alone with the impossible choice. His right hand gripped the doorframe. I watched the tendons on the back of his hand stand out. Then I saw the tremor. It was a small, quick shake he couldn't control. He was scared too. My anger began to drain away. I saw the man beneath the title then, burdened by more than any person should carry. The way he'd looked at me just then, I didn't know what to do with that. I have lost people before, Kalen said. His voice was soft and rough. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. The words just hung in the air between us. He turned his head away from me. His shoulders dropped a little like a weight had settled there. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I pushed myself up from the chair. I crossed the quiet space until I stood before him. I could feel the warmth from his body. Our eyes locked. He leaned forward just an inch. I saw the conflict in his face, the want and the duty warring. Then he stopped himself. He turned and walked a few steps toward the windows. He looked out at the misty woods. The space between us felt different now. I did not beg. I made my voice steady. I know what he's asking you to sacrifice, I said. I'm asking you to believe you can outsmart him. Kalen turned back to face me. He looked shaken. He reached out his hand. It stopped short of my cheek, hovering in the air. His fingers were so close I could almost feel them. If I do this, he rasped, it is not for the human. It is for the look in your eyes if I do not. My throat ached with all the words I hadn't spoken. The sharp, clean scent of pine resin met me inside the armory's stone archway. It cut through the lingering taste of mist. Kalen stood over a map spread on a heavy oak table. Marlon, the scout with a deep scar through his eyebrow, shook his head. You cannot be the only target, Marlon said. He will swarm you. Kalen moved a carved stone token across the map. His voice was flat and final. I draw them to the front of the mill, he said. The rest of you flank from the river path. I saw the plan then. He was the sacrifice. He would walk into the open and let Vexus focus every weapon on him. My chest felt tight. I pushed past the warriors lining the walls. No, I said. My voice was steel in the quiet room. I'm coming with you to the front. Kalen's head snapped up. Marlon stared at me like I was mad. Kalen moved from the table so fast the tokens rattled. He loomed over me, his shadow blocking the dawn light from the high window. It's too dangerous, he roared. The sound echoed off the stone. His eyes were wild, his fear looking like fury. I didn't move. I kept my arms at my sides. He saw I wouldn't flinch. He took one step back and pressed the heel of his hand hard against his forehead. If I stay behind, you're distracted, I said. My logic sounded calm. You'll be listening for me, not watching him. That gets Felix killed. Kalen was quiet for too long. He just looked at me, his breath a harsh sound in the quiet. Finally, he let his hand fall. He gave a single, sharp nod to Marlon. Change of plan, Kalen said, his voice rough. He pointed to the map, to a spot near the mill's old foundation. The covert team infiltrates here, the secondary access point. He looked only at the map, not at me. You go with them. You stay out of sight. That is the only way I do this. The order was absolute. The bond between us twisted, a shared, sharp pain. He turned away to pick up a heavy axe from a rack. He tested its edge with his thumb. He did not look back. The knot in my ribs pulled tighter with every step I took away from the main gate. The covert team had melted into the trees ahead of me. I was supposed to follow them, but my boots just kept sinking into the wet earth. I couldn't move. That's when Marlon broke from the trees below. He sprinted straight to Kalen. I saw his mouth moving fast, his hands cutting through the air. Kalen went completely still, then his head snapped up. His eyes found mine across the distance, and for 1 second his control shattered. I saw pure fear. It was bright and sharp, and it was all for me. Then it was gone. His face went blank again, that cold mask sliding back into place. He turned to Silas, his beta. He leaned in close. I saw Silas shake his head once hard. Kalen's hand shot out and gripped Silas's shoulder. His fingers dug in. He spoke again, his mouth forming words I could read from the ridge. When the explosion happens, you are Alpha. Lead them home. Silas just stared at him, his face white. Kalen turned back to his warriors. He raised his voice. We storm the main gate, draw their fire. It was a lie. It was a death sentence, and they all believed him. Then he walked away from them. He didn't head for the mill. He came up the slope, straight toward me. His own warriors watched him abandon his command. Their confused whispers chased him up the hill. He stopped an arm's length away. His breath made little clouds in the damp air. The mill is rigged with silver dust, he said. His voice was flat, empty. It triggers on an Alpha's presence. He looked past me into the dark trees. You were never going to the pens, were you? I didn't answer. He already knew. My stupid, desperate plan to find Felix myself was written all over my face. He gave one stiff nod, then he just walked past me. He headed into the deeper woods, and he didn't look back. I knew what it meant. I was supposed to follow him. The service door groaned when I pushed it open. My boots splashed into a cold, oily puddle. A steam pipe hissed somewhere above me, and I flinched. Water dripped from a rusty pipe and landed on my shoulder. I followed the narrow passage, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The shouts of the assault team were getting closer. But all I could think about was his face on that ridge. The raw fear in his eyes. He's not human, I reminded myself. Remember that. But the memory of his hand, hovering near my cheek like he wanted to touch me, that was a human thing. I rounded a corner and almost ran right into him. Kalen was standing alone where 3 corridors met. He wasn't with his warriors. He was just waiting. He stood rigid under his leather jacket. A fresh cut bled along his jaw, and his eyes, they were fixed on the wall. They had this hollow, empty look. Like a man who'd already lost everything. I stopped a few feet away. My own breathing was the only sound. He finally turned his head. He looked at me, and that hollow look didn't change. You shouldn't be here, he said. His voice was rough. I told you to stay with the covert team. You walked into the woods, I said. You knew I'd follow. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his hands. The silver trap, it wasn't just for any Alpha, he said. Vexus designed it for me, a specific frequency. My presence alone would set it off. It would have killed everyone inside. He finally met my eyes, including Felix. The air left my lungs. So you sent the others to the main gate, as a distraction. It was the only play, he said. His shoulders slumped just a little. But Marlon scouted the secondary access, the one you were supposed to take. He took a step toward me. He found a second trigger, a backup. It's not keyed to an Alpha's presence. His voice dropped. It's keyed to an Omega's. The world tilted, to me. He nodded. If you decrossed that threshold, you would have detonated it. You and the whole covert team. He ran a hand over his face. The cut on his jaw smeared. I saw you on that ridge, and I knew I had to get you away from them. Everything clicked into place. The fear in his eyes, the lie to his pack, abandoning his own command. He hadn't been coming to stop me. He'd been coming to save me. And in doing that, he'd left his warriors to storm a gate, thinking he was leading them. He'd let them walk into a fight without their Alpha, all to pull me out of a trap I was too stupid to see. Your men, I whispered. They're down there because of me. They're down there because I ordered it, he said, his voice turning hard. The blame is mine. He looked down the corridor toward the sound of fighting. But the fight's not at the gate. Vexus isn't there. He's here, in the complex. He looked back at me. He has Felix. And he knows you're coming. A cold dread settled in my stomach. It's a trap, for both of us. Yes, Kalen said. He finally moved. He closed the distance between us, but he didn't touch me. So here is my new order. You will turn around. You will go back the way you came. You will find Silas and you will run. I shook my head. No. This is not a discussion. The words were a low growl. That hollow look was gone, burned away by a fierce, frantic light. He wants the bond, don't you see? He wants to break it in front of me. He wants to take you apart piece by piece until I lose my mind. I cannot fight him and protect you at the same time. Then don't protect me. The words burst out of me. Fight him, let me handle myself. He stared at me, a muscle worked in his jaw. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to trust me, I said. My voice shook, but I didn't look away. Just once. Trust that I'm not made of glass. The sound of fighting got suddenly louder. A crash echoed down the corridor. Shouts. A pained howl that was definitely Wolf. Kalen's head snapped toward the sound. His whole body went tense. The conflict on his face was a physical thing. I saw the war in his eyes, the alpha who needed to command and the man who was terrified to lose. He looked back at me. His eyes searched my face. If I tell you to run, he said, his voice low and strained, you will run. No arguments, no heroics. You find Silas and you get out. I held his gaze. And if you don't tell me to run? He was silent for a beat too long. Then you stay behind me, he said finally. You do exactly as I say, and if I fall, you run anyway. It wasn't trust, it was a compromise, the only one he could make. I nodded. Okay. He let out a breath. It sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for years. Okay, he echoed. Then he turned toward the sound of the fight. He didn't look back this time. He just started walking, and I followed a step behind. The hollow look was gone from his eyes. Now there was only fire. And for the first time, I wasn't following him into the dark. We were walking into it together. Real quick, if you're here for the moment the other shoe finally drops, hit subscribe. Trust me, it gets better. Kalen didn't answer Riker. He just kept moving toward a junction in the corridor. Two of Vexus's guards rounded the corner. They were huge with these crackling shock clubs. Kalen moved before they could even shout. He took the first one down with a single, hard strike to the throat. The second guard swung his club. Kalen caught the man's arm and twisted. I heard the bones snap. The guard screamed. Then Riker's voice came through the speaker again, louder and sharper. By the law of the council, you are ordered to return. Renounce the outsider and face judgment. If you refuse, you will be severed. Kalen froze. It was only for a second. His head jerked like he'd been slapped. But that 1 second was all it took. The guard with the broken arm lunged. He had a hidden blade. It sank deep into Kalen's side. Kalen made this choked, awful sound. He shoved the man away, but the knife stayed in him, buried to the hilt. The guard stumbled backward, right toward me. His good hand was reaching for me. I didn't think. I grabbed the shock club from the floor where the first guard had dropped it. I jammed it into the base of the guy's spine. He collapsed right at my feet, twitching. I turned back to Kalen. He was on one knee. His face was bone white. He was staring at nothing. It wasn't the knife in his side. It was the severance, the alpha link to his pack. It was just gone. He looked at me. All the command was gone from his voice. It was just a man's voice, rough and quiet. It's done, he said. He pulled the knife from his side with a grimace and dropped it. It clattered on the concrete. The way he looked at me just then, it wasn't about the threat. I didn't know what to do with that. Then Felix's voice fizzed in my ear. I've got the lab schematics, you're close, but Vexus is inside. He's powering something up. Kalen forced himself to stand. He pressed a hand to his bleeding side. He didn't reach for me. He just nodded toward the sealed door where the humming grew louder. The rest made sense. Why he hadn't reached for me when he stood didn't. The phantom weight of his staggering body pressed against my shoulder as I steadied him. We stumbled through the lab's vapor-sealed doors into a sterile chill. It smelled like ozone and burnt wiring. The lab was a wide, bright space. Steel tables, humming machines. Vexus Crow stood at a central console with his back to us. Felix crackled in my ear. The power conduit is behind the main console. It's unstable. Kalen pushed away from me. He stood on his own, but the movement was slow. A fresh bloodstain bloomed on his torn shirt. His eyes were fixed on Vexus. It's over, Crow. His voice was flat, all command gone, just a statement. Vexus turned. He looked pleased. Is it? You severed the link. You are no one's alpha. He gestured to a thick cable. It snaked from the console to a glass chamber. Inside, a pale Omega woman sat slumped. The serum matrix needs a regulator, Vexus said. Your mate's unique gift will make the process sustainable. No more broken vessels. I felt a cold anger then. It was clean and sharp. I looked at Kalen. He was staring at the Omega in the chamber. His throat worked as he swallowed. He looked at me and his eyes held a question I had never seen in them before. It wasn't a command. It was a man asking. I stepped toward the console, away from Kalen. You want a regulator? I said to Vexus. My fingers found the main power switch he had been guarding. Try running your machine without power. I threw the switch. the lights died, the machines whined down into silence. In the sudden dark, the only light came from emergency strips on the floor. Vexus roared and lunged at me. I braced for the impact. It never came. Kalen moved between us. He didn't attack Vexus. He just stood there taking the full force of Vexus's charge. They crashed into a bank of instruments. I heard the sick sound of impact. Kalen's hands came up not to strike, but to grip Vexus's arms. He held on, pinning them both in place. He turned his head toward me in the gloom. His mouth formed one word: go. I pushed it aside. Why Kalen had taken the hit instead of attacking would come back. The chemical sting still clung to the back of my throat. My boots sank into the damp earth as I reached the edge of the woods. The old mill stood ahead, its stone walls dark with moss. A service door stood ajar. I slipped inside after Kalen. The air inside was cold and still. It smelled of old wood rot and wet stone. We moved through empty hallways toward a low hum of machinery. Kalen, the alpha who had just severed his pack link for me, moved with a limp. He led me to a metal grate in the floor of a storage room. He pointed down. Through the slats I saw the lab. A large machine glowed with a sickly green light. Wires and tubes snaked from it to a central chair. An Omega woman was strapped into it. She looked thin, her head lolled to one side. Vexus stood beside the machine. He adjusted a dial. Then he spoke. His voice echoed from speakers in the walls. He said the machine amplified the bond energy between an alpha and his mate. It could broadcast that energy like a signal. It could force submission on any shifter who heard it, but it needed a special catalyst to work. Vexus turned. He looked right at the grate where we hid. He couldn't see us in the dark, but he knew we were there. He said my name. He said my calming gift was not for kindness. He said it was the perfect carrier wave. Bonded energy from Kalen and me pushed through his machine would make every Omega a willing vessel. They would not fight the serum extraction. They would ask for it. I felt sick. My stomach twisted hard. I thought of Felix locked somewhere in this place. I had to protect him. I had to protect all of them. I looked at Kalen. His lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line. His breathing was shallow and quick. He was hurt. He was cut off from his pack. He had nothing left but me. Kalen's claws slid from his fingertips. They scraped against the metal grate. The sound was too loud. Guards below looked up. Vexus smiled a thin, cruel smile. He gave a signal. More guards poured into the lab from every door. They sealed the exits. They aimed guns and crossbows at the gallery. We were trapped above them. We had no way down except through them. Kalen could not fight that many in his state. I put a hand on his arm to stop him. He flinched at my touch. He hadn't chosen me. The bond had. There was a difference. That difference felt like a wall between us now. He looked from the guards to me. His eyes held a deep, tired pain. He saw the same choice I did. To fight was to die and give Vexus everything. To do nothing was a worse kind of death. The knife felt cold and wrong in my hand. It was a sharp, hard fact in a world that had gone completely soft at the edges. Kalen was bleeding out beside me, and his only plan was to be the bait. He leaned in closer. His breath was warm against my ear. The main conduit is on the west wall. A thick bundle of black cables. Cut them all. Outside the door, the guard's hand closed on the handle. The metal latch began to turn with a slow, grinding click. Kalen's eyes met mine in the flashing red dark. There was no more anger there, just a grim, quiet acceptance. He gave me a single, sharp nod. Then he exploded into motion. He hit the door with his shoulder just as it started to open. Slammed into the guard on the other side with a sickening thud. There was a shout, cut short. Kalen was through the gap, a blur of pain and fury, pulling the stunned guard into the closet with him. Go, he snarled over his shoulder at me. I went left, I ran. The hallway was a blur of sterile white and panic. Alarms started blaring somewhere, a harsh, bleeding sound. Shouts echoed from the direction of the lab. I didn't look back. I just ran toward the west wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. And there it was, a massive industrial panel humming with a low, dangerous energy. A thick nest of black cables snaked out from it, pulsing with a faint blue light. The machine's lifeblood. I skidded to a stop in front of it. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I just started sawing with the knife. The blade bit into the first cable. Sparks flew, hot and bright, stinging my face. The hum pitched higher, becoming a shriek of protesting metal. I cut another and another. Blue light flickered and died. The alarms changed tone, becoming a continuous, frantic wail. A hand closed on my shoulder from behind. I spun, slashing out blindly with the knife. It was Felix. His eyes were wide with fear, but he grabbed my wrist. Lyra, it's me. He looked terrible. pale, bruised but alive. He pointed down a side corridor. "They're coming, the whole place is locking down." From the direction of the closet, I heard a roar. It was pure, undiluted pain. "Kaylin, I made a choice." I grabbed Felix's hand. "We have to go back. We can't, the exits are. We are not leaving him." We ran back toward the sound. The hallway was filling with smoke from the sparking conduit. 2 guards lay unconscious near the open closet door. Kaylin was on his knees just inside, one hand braced against the wall. His other arm hung limp at his side. The front of his shirt was soaked dark red. He looked up as we crashed in. His gaze went from me to Felix and back to me. Something in his face shifted. The conduit. "Gone," I said, panting. A ghost of a smile touched his bloodied mouth. "Good." Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed. 3 days later, the silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. We were in a high, dusty storage room above what was left of the lab. Sunlight streamed in through broken windows, making the floating dust look like gold. Kaylin was propped against an old metal shelf. The bleeding had stopped, but the wound on his side was an ugly, angry tear. I ripped a long strip from the bottom of my shirt. The sound was too loud in the quiet. I knelt beside him. He watched me, his face pale and tight with pain. When I reached for his side, his hand came up. His fingers wrapped around my wrist. They were cold. I expected him to push me away, to tell me he could do it himself. But he didn't. He just looked at my face, then at the cloth in my hand. His grip loosened. He let go. He let me help him. "It should have killed me the first time," he said, his voice rough. "This wound, it never truly heals." I pressed the cloth against the cut. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull back. "Lyra wasn't taken in an ambush," he said. "The name just hung there." I kept my hands steady, applying pressure. "Our old alpha turned tyrant," he continued, staring at a crack in the far wall. "He threatened the children, his mate's power. It was the only thing holding his control together. The only way to break him was to cut that power off at the source, to sever a bond." He swallowed hard. "I felt our bond, it was warm, it was everything, and I cut it." His eyes closed. "I felt her life fade through me. I saved my pack. I murdered my mate." When he opened his eyes again, there was nothing in them, just a hollow, empty space. "This scar isn't a warrior's mark. It's a coward's brand. I've believed ever since that to love is to destroy." My hands were still on his side. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle. Without even thinking, I lifted my other hand. I cupped the side of his face. My thumb brushed the skin under his eye. He went completely still. A faint tremor that had been running through him just stopped. The room was silent. I looked at him, at all that pain he carried alone. I didn't know if I could carry it with him. I didn't know if I should. But my thumb was still on his cheek. And for once, I didn't need an answer for why. The warmth from his tear was still on my thumb when I stepped out onto the catwalk. The metal grating shook under my boots, vibrating with the deep, heavy hum of the machines below. I looked over the railing. Down on the central dais, Vexus Crow stood behind a clear shield, adjusting controls on a glowing console. The machine's hum climbed into a painful, high whine. Felix and 2 others were strapped to metal frames, their heads slumped forward. Kaylin moved up beside me. I could hear his breathing, rough and uneven, in my ear. He pointed with a bloody hand toward the far wall. "The coolant lines," he said, his voice thin from the pain. Felix's schematics showed a valve there. I followed his direction. A big silver pipe ran down the wall near a group of guards. A red wheel valve was set into its side. I just nodded. Kaylin didn't wait for a plan. He took the knife from his belt, and with a grunt of effort, he threw it. The blade spun through the air and struck the valve wheel with a loud clang. The wheel didn't break. It just spun a little. The guards below looked up at the sound. They saw us. One of them shouted a warning to Vexus. 5 guards at the base of the catwalk started climbing a ladder right toward us. The metal rungs shook under their weight. Kaylin braced himself against the railing. He was hurt, cut off from his pack. He looked at me. There was a quiet acceptance in his tired eyes. It wasn't the look of a man about to win a fight. It was the look of a man ready to buy time. Then he stepped in front of me. He put his body between me and the ladder. "Go," he said. He didn't look back. I didn't go. I pushed past him instead. I reached the top of the ladder just as the first guard's head appeared. I didn't hit him. I focused on the feeling I always fought against, the calm I could push out. I let it wash over the guard. His grip on the ladder faltered. His eyes blinked slowly. He was confused. He slumped against the rungs. The man below him cursed and tried to shove him up. I pushed the feeling harder. It drained me fast like running a mile. Both guards just stalled on the ladder. Kalen saw his chance. He moved with a sudden burst of speed, grabbed the railing, and kicked out. His boot connected with the first guard's shoulder. The man fell back into the one below. They both tumbled off the ladder and crashed onto the concrete. We scrambled down while the other guards were distracted and ran for the central dais. Kalen fought anyone who got close, but he moved slower than I'd ever seen. Each swing of his arm seemed to cost him. He left a trail of blood on the floor. We reached the dais steps. Vexus watched us from behind his shield. He didn't look worried. He smiled and pressed a final button on his console. The machine's whine peaked. A bright beam of light shot from an overhead array, aimed right at Kalen. He turned to shove me out of the way. The light hit him square in the chest. He screamed. It was a raw sound of pure agony. He dropped to his knees, his hands flying to his head. His whole body shook violently. He was fighting something I couldn't see. The scream was still a physical vibration in my teeth, a raw frequency scraping my nerves from the inside. I dragged Kalen's dead weight into an alcove, my shoulder pressing against a cold metal panel covered in faded safety warnings. The air here was thick with the smell of stale grease and rust. I let him slide down against the wall. His head lolled forward. His hands lay open on the floor, palms up. I thought he was gone. Then his chest moved. One shallow, ragged breath. I crouched and put my hands on his face. I made him look at me. His eyes were open, but they didn't see me. They were wide and fixed on some horror inside his own head. "Kalen," I said. My voice sounded small in the metal space. He didn't react. I remembered his confession in the dark about severing his first bond. The machine's light had only been aimed at him because his will was the one Vexus needed to break. He had to choose submission. I slapped his cheek. Not hard, but enough to sting. "Look at me." His eyes blinked slowly. They focused on my mouth, then my eyes. A terrible understanding passed over his face. He pushed my hands away. He tried to stand, using the wall for support. His legs shook and gave out. He slid back down, hitting the floor with a thud. He looked at his own trembling hands with a kind of disgust. "It's in my head," he said, his voice rough. "It's showing me every failure, every loss. It's telling me to kneel." He closed his eyes tight. To make it stop. I knew then the fight wasn't outside this alcove. It was inside him. He was the battlefield. I felt a sharp ache for him, a pull that had nothing to do with tactics. I reached out and covered his shaking hands with mine. He turned his hands under mine and gripped them. His hold was too tight, desperate. He looked at our joined hands, then at me. The vacant horror was gone, replaced by a clear and painful decision. "You have to go," he said. "Get to Felix. Get out." I shook my head. He pulled one hand free and pointed to the knife on his belt, the one from the cell. "Take it, go." This wasn't an alpha command. It was a plea. It was a man choosing to stay behind, to let the machine break him, so I could run. He hadn't chosen me before. Something else had put us here. There was a difference. This was his choice, and I made mine. I didn't take the knife. I leaned forward and pressed my forehead against his. I felt his breath catch. "Then we both stay," I said. The smell of the coagulant gel was stuck in my nose. It had been 3 days and I could still smell it. I finally stopped pacing at the edge of the western landing pad. The wind smelled like dry dirt and electricity. A dust storm was coming. Kalen found me there. He stood a few feet away, his outline dark against the hazy sky. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched the horizon with me. Dust was already gathering on the shoulders of his shirt. "The transports for the freed Omegas leave at dawn," he said. His voice was quiet. It had no command in it. "The council approved their sanctuary." "Good," I said. The word felt too small. I kept watching the brown clouds churning in the distance. My side ached where the beam had hit me. It was a constant, dull reminder. I waited for him to leave. He didn't. "You should be with them," he said after a long minute. "On one of those transports, to a safe territory, a normal life." He said it like it was a fact. I turned to look at him. His profile was tense. A muscle in his cheek kept twitching. It was the only thing moving. "Is that an order?" "No." The word came out fast and sharp. He finally looked at me. His eyes were shadowed. "It's the last thing I will ever ask of you." The wind pulled at our hair. The space between us felt huge and also thin enough to tear. I thought of the knife on the concrete floor. The one he'd told me to take. He'd been giving me a way out even then. A tool to defend myself from everyone, including him. That understanding was a quiet hurt in my chest. You asked me to believe you could outsmart Vexus, I said. I did. You asked me to stay hidden. I didn't. So don't ask me for this. He let his breath out slowly. He looked down at his hands. He turned them over like he didn't recognize them. I have nothing left to offer, he said. The raw honesty of it hit me like a punch. No pack, no title, only the bond, and that is not a gift, it's a chain. I took a step toward him, dust swirled around our feet. You offered a knife, I said. My voice was low. I'm offering a choice back, my choice. He went completely still. His eyes lifted to mine. In them I saw the shattered man from the alcove, but I also saw the leader who walked into a trap for me. The warmth of the bond was a deep pull, like a river under ice. He didn't move. I didn't close the last step. We stood there as the storm gathered. The thing we could be hung in the air between us, untouched. My palms still tingled. They felt hollow and drained from what I'd done in Kalen's mind. I stepped over a fallen beam onto the central dais. My boots crunched on shattered crystal that glittered with a dying light. Vexus Crow stood alone by the main console. His fingers flew across the keys. A deep hum started in the wrecked machine around us. The air got warm and thick. It smelled like hot plastic. Kalen leaned heavily against a twisted metal strut behind me. His breathing was a rough scrape in the quiet. I saw a fresh line of blood track from the corner of his mouth down his jaw. He pushed himself upright. His whole body leaned to one side. He's overloading the core, Felix's voice crackled in my ear. He sounded far away. I see it from the auxiliary panel. It'll blow in maybe 2 minutes. Vexus looked up. His smile was a thin, tight line. A fitting pyre for a failed alpha and his defective mate, he said. He didn't move from the console. The hum climbed to a painful whine. I felt it in my teeth. Kalen took a staggering step forward. He placed himself between me and Vexus. He said nothing. His shoulders were set in a way that meant he had nothing left to give. I was scared, but my hands were completely still. Felix, I said in